The moment we turned off the main road onto the long, tree-lined driveway, I felt something shift in my chest. It was a physical sensation, a tightening, a sense of recognition that I couldn't explain and couldn't dismiss. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of Liam's car in a rhythm that felt strangely, disturbingly familiar, like a song I had heard in a dream and couldn't quite remember upon waking. The way the afternoon light filtered through the branches of the ancient oaks that lined the driveway, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of gold and shadow, stirred something deep in my memory, something buried so far down I hadn't even known it was there. I had never been to his family's estate before, at least not that I could consciously recall. I had never even been to this part of the state, a rural expanse of rolling hills and old money and families whose roots went back centuries. And yet, as we rounded the final curve and the house came into view, I knew with a certainty that defied all logic and reason that I had seen it before. Not in photographs, not in dreams, but in real life. I had stood on this gravel driveway. I had looked up at this house. I had been here, somehow, somewhere in the forgotten corridors of my own past. The house was enormous, a sprawling Victorian mansion with a wraparound porch and a turret on the eastern side. Its exterior painted a soft, weathered gray with white trim that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Ivy climbed the walls in careful, cultivated patterns, the kind of ivy that takes decades to establish, the kind that speaks of generations of gardeners tending the same soil. The gardens that surrounded it were immaculate, a riot of late summer flowers in shades of purple and pink and crimson, with stone pathways winding through them and a fountain visible in the distance, its water catching the light and scattering it into tiny rainbows. It was the kind of house that belonged in a magazine, the kind of house that had been in a family for generations and would be for generations more, the kind of house that carried its history in every brick and every floorboard and every carefully preserved antique. It was exactly as Liam had described it over the months we had been together, the childhood home he spoke of with a mixture of affection and exasperation, the place where he had learned to ride a bike and climb trees and hidden from his sisters during games of hide-and-seek. And it was exactly as I remembered it, even though I had no conscious memory of ever being here. "You're quiet," Liam said, glancing at me with the warm, easy smile that had made me fall in love with him the very first time we met at a friend's dinner party 2 years ago. "Nervous about meeting the whole clan?" I forced myself to smile back, pushing the strange feeling down into the pit of my stomach where it could be ignored, at least temporarily. "A little," I admitted, and it wasn't entirely a lie. "Meeting your entire family at once is intimidating. Your mother, your father, your grandmother, your sisters, the aunts and uncles and cousins you've told me about. It's a lot of people to impress all at the same time." "You don't have to impress anyone," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with the casual tenderness that had always been his way. His hand was warm and solid and reassuring, an anchor in the midst of my sudden, inexplicable confusion. "They're going to love you. I love you, and that's all that matters to them. My mother has been asking about you for months. My grandmother is already planning where to seat you at Christmas dinner. You're not walking into a tribunal, Emma. You're walking into a family that's ready to welcome you with open arms." I wanted to believe him. I had been wanting to believe him for the 6 months since he had proposed, since he had slipped his grandmother's antique ring onto my finger in the middle of a crowded restaurant and promised me a future filled with love and family and belonging. I had grown up without those things, raised by a single mother who had worked herself to exhaustion to provide for me, who had loved me fiercely and completely, but who had been the only family I ever knew. No siblings, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles or cousins. Just my mother and me, a tiny island of two in a vast and indifferent world. And then my mother had died when I was 19, taken by a sudden aneurysm that gave no warning and offered no chance to say goodbye, and I had been truly alone. Liam's family, with their sprawling estate and their generations of history and their traditions that stretched back more than a century, represented everything I had ever wanted and never had. A place to belong, a history to be part of, a future that was connected to a past, a web of relationships that would catch me if I fell and hold me up when I was weak. The car pulled up in front of the house, and before I could gather my scattered thoughts, the massive oak front door flew open and a woman emerged. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair swept back in a chic chignon and a dress of pale blue linen that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Liam's mother, Margaret. She descended the porch steps with the grace of a woman who had been welcoming guests to this house for decades, her arms outstretched in greeting, her smile warm and genuine. Behind her, I could see more figures gathering in the doorway, silhouettes against the light from the grand foyer. "You must be Emma," Margaret said, taking both of my hands in hers and studying my face with an intensity that felt slightly unsettling, as if she were searching for something she couldn't quite find. "Liam has told us so much about you, but his descriptions didn't do you justice. You're even more beautiful than I expected. Welcome to Ashford House." Ashford House. The name echoed in my mind, reverberating through corridors of memory I hadn't known existed until this very moment. Ashford House. I had heard that name before, not from Liam, although he had mentioned it in passing, usually just calling it the estate or my family's place. I had heard it somewhere else, sometime else, in a voice I couldn't quite identify. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, speaking to me when I was very small. "We're going to Ashford House," the voice said in my memory, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. I had been here before. The certainty was growing stronger with every passing second, even as I smiled and thanked Margaret for her hospitality and followed her into the grand foyer. The interior of the house was even more stunning than the exterior. The foyer soared upward for 2 full stories, crowned by a crystal chandelier that glittered with 1,000 facets of light. A curved staircase with a polished mahogany banister swept upward to the 2nd floor, its steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced men and elegant women in clothing that spanned centuries, the Ashford ancestors who had built this house and maintained it and passed it down through the generations. And above the massive stone fireplace, in a place of honor, hung a portrait of a man in Victorian clothing, his expression stern but his eyes holding a hint of warmth that the artist had somehow managed to capture. All of it was familiar. The chandelier, the staircase, the portrait, the way the light fell through the tall windows and pooled on the polished hardwood floors. I had seen all of this before, through the eyes of a child. The family was gathered in the formal living room, arranged on antique furniture that had probably been in the family for 100 years or more. Liam's father, Edward, was a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, and the same easy smile that his son had inherited. He shook my hand warmly and welcomed me to their home with a sincerity that made my throat tight. His 2 sisters, Caroline and Amelia, were younger versions of their mother, elegant and poised, and they offered polite smiles and curious glances that held no hostility but plenty of interest. There were others too, an aunt and uncle whose names I immediately forgot, a pair of cousins who looked to be about my age, a family friend who seemed to be treated as an honorary relative. It was a lot of people to keep track of, and I found myself nodding and smiling and trying desperately to remember names and faces. And then there was the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, a tiny, bird-like woman named Eleanor who sat in a wingback chair by the window with a knitted blanket draped over her knees despite the warmth of the day. She was older than anyone else in the room by at least a decade, her skin papery and thin, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were sharp and clear and missing nothing. When Liam introduced me to her, bending down to kiss her cheek and then gesturing for me to come closer, she looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being examined under a microscope. Her gaze traveled over my face, my hair, my posture, and her mouth tightened into a thin line that might have been disapproval or might have been something else entirely. "Emma," she said, her voice reedy but still commanding, the voice of a woman who was used to being listened to. "That's an interesting name. Tell me, is it short for something? Emily, perhaps? Emmeline?" The question caught me off guard. "Just Emma," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. My mother chose it because she thought it was simple and elegant. She didn't like names that could be shortened into nicknames. Your mother, Eleanor repeated, her gaze never leaving my face. There was something in her eyes now, something that looked almost like recognition mixed with a deep, patient sadness. And what was your mother's name, if I may ask? Claire, I said. Claire Bennett. Something flickered in the old woman's eyes, something that might have been shock, or might have been grief, or might have been the sudden, jarring confirmation of a suspicion she had been nursing since the moment I walked through the door. But it was gone before I could identify it, replaced by a cool, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A lovely name, she said, her voice perfectly neutral. Welcome to our home, Emma. I hope you'll be very happy here, and I look forward to getting to know you better during your stay. The afternoon proceeded with the usual rituals of meeting a fiancé's family. Tea was served in delicate china cups that looked too fragile to actually use, painted with tiny roses and rimmed with gold that had faded slightly with age. Questions were asked about my background, my job as a graphic designer at a small firm in the city, my intentions for the future. I answered them all as honestly as I could, explaining that I had grown up in a small town about 2 hours away, a place none of them had heard of, that my mother had passed away when I was 19, and that I had no other family to speak of. I watched their faces as I spoke, looking for signs of judgment or disapproval, but they were too well-bred to show anything other than polite interest and the warm, inclusive curiosity of people who genuinely wanted to welcome a newcomer into their fold. Caroline asked about my work, and we discovered a shared interest in watercolor painting. Amelia wanted to know about how Liam and I had met, and I told the story of the dinner party, the spilled wine, the conversation that had lasted until 2 in the morning. It was all perfectly pleasant, perfectly normal, perfectly in keeping with what a meeting like this should be. But the whole time, I was distracted by the house. Every room we entered, every hallway we walked down, every window we looked out of, triggered another flash of recognition that I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. The library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and its rolling ladder and its smell of old paper and leather bindings. I had stood in that room before, running my fingers along the spines of the books, pulling out volumes at random to look at the pictures because I couldn't yet read the words. The kitchen with its enormous stone fireplace and its long wooden table that could seat 20 people. I had sat at that table, swinging my legs because my feet didn't reach the floor, eating cookies that someone had baked for me, someone with warm hands and a gentle voice. The back garden with its maze of hedges and its old stone fountain with the statue of a dancing girl at its center. I had played there, hiding among the roses, laughing as someone chased me, someone who was calling my name, not Emma, but something else, something I couldn't quite hear. It wasn't until we reached the upstairs hallway, the one that led to the guest bedroom where Liam and I would be staying during our visit, that the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a force that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. I stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, a door that was slightly smaller than the others, painted white with a brass handle that was worn smooth from years of use. The door was unremarkable in every way, just a door like any other door, but I knew it. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond memory and into the realm of something almost mystical. I knew what was behind that door. What's in there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my hand reaching out of its own accord to touch the worn brass handle. Liam glanced at the door, his expression casual and unconcerned. That's just an old storage room, he said with a shrug. It's been locked for as long as I can remember. My grandmother keeps the key, and she never lets anyone go in there. I think it used to be something else a long time ago, a nursery or something, but it's been storage for decades. Why do you ask? No reason, I said, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, in my wrists, in the pulse point at the base of my throat. I knew what was behind that door. It wasn't a storage room. It was a child's bedroom. And I had slept there. I had lived there. I had belonged there, once a long, long time ago. The rest of the day passed in a blur of conversation and dinner and polite socializing that I navigated on autopilot. Liam noticed that something was wrong. I could see it in the concerned glances he kept throwing my way, but he didn't press. He probably assumed I was overwhelmed by the family, by the house, by the sheer weight of new impressions and new people. He had no idea that I was drowning in memories I couldn't explain, fragments of a past that I had never known existed, but that was somehow rising to the surface of my consciousness like bubbles from the depths of a dark and uncharted sea. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest bed next to Liam, listening to his slow, steady breathing, watching the moonlight shift across the ceiling as the hours crept by. The house was silent around us, the kind of deep, settled silence that old houses have, a silence that is made of wood and stone and the accumulated quiet of a century of nights. But my mind was anything but silent. It was racing, grasping at the fragments of memory that had been surfacing all day, trying to piece them together into a coherent narrative. I had been here before. I was certain of it now, more certain than I had ever been of anything in my life. But when? And why? And why didn't anyone in the family recognize me? Why had my mother never mentioned this house, this family, this place that was clearly a part of my history? The answer came to me in the early hours of the morning, when the house was at its most still and the sky outside the window was just beginning to lighten with the first pale hints of dawn. It came not as a fully formed thought, but as a voice, a memory of a voice, my mother's voice, speaking to me when I was very small. She was telling me a story, a bedtime story, the kind she used to invent when I couldn't sleep. It was a story about a beautiful house where she had once lived, a house with a turret and a maze garden and a little white room at the end of the hall. She had described it so vividly, with so much detail and so much love, that I had always assumed it was a fairy tale, a fantasy she had created to entertain a child who loved stories about princesses and castles. But it wasn't a fairy tale. It was this house. It was Ashford House. And my mother had lived here, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as a member of the family. She had been married to someone in this house, and I had been here with her. I sat up in bed so abruptly that the movement jostled the mattress and woke Liam from his sleep. He stirred beside me, his eyes opening blearily, his hand reaching for me in the darkness. "Emma," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What's wrong? Are you okay? What time is it?" "I need to talk to your grandmother," I said, already swinging my legs over the side of the bed, already reaching for my robe. "I need to talk to her right now, alone. It can't wait until morning." "Emma, it's 5 in the morning," he protested, pushing himself up on his elbows. "My grandmother is 87 years old. She doesn't wake up until 8 at the earliest. Can't this wait a few hours?" "No," I said, and my voice was firmer than I expected, firmer than I felt. "It can't wait. I'm sorry, Liam. I'll explain everything later, I promise. But right now, I need to talk to your grandmother. Please. It's important." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like fear. But he trusted me. He had always trusted me, from the very beginning of our relationship, and that trust didn't waver now. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll let her nurse know you're coming. She's usually awake early, even if she doesn't leave her room. Go. Do what you need to do." I found Eleanor in her private sitting room, a small, warm space attached to her bedroom on the first floor. She was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, a book open in her lap. She was fully dressed, her silver hair neatly arranged, her posture as straight and commanding as it had been the day before. When I entered the room, breathless and disheveled from my rush through the house, she looked up at me with those sharp, clear eyes, and her expression was not one of surprise. It was one of resignation, of quiet, patient waiting, as if she had been expecting this moment since the instant I walked through her front door. "You've remembered," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for 20 years. "I don't know what I've remembered," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to control it. I lowered myself into the chair across from her, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. "I just know that I've been here before. A long time ago, when I was a child. I know the little white room at the end of the hall. I know the maze garden. I know the portrait above the fireplace in the foyer. I know the way the light comes through the windows in the library in the afternoon. I know this house, and I don't understand why, and I need you to tell me the truth." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, her thin, gnarled hands folded in her lap. She seemed to be gathering herself, summoning the strength for a conversation she had hoped she would never have to have, but had always known, in her heart, was inevitable. Finally, she sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, from the very core of her being, and she began to speak. "You were 4 years old when you lived here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Your mother, Claire, was my son's wife. My youngest son, William, Liam's uncle. She was his second wife, and he loved her more than I have ever seen a man love a woman. When he brought her home to meet the family, he was practically glowing. He told me that he had finally found the person he was meant to spend his life with. And he brought you with her, a little girl with big eyes and a serious expression, a child who was not his by blood, but who became his in every way that mattered." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles white, my mind reeling as I tried to process what she was telling me. "My mother was married to Liam's uncle?" I managed to say, my voice coming out as a choked whisper. "William Ashford was my stepfather? That would mean that Liam and I are cousins," Eleanor finished, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "By marriage, not by blood. You are not biologically related to this family, Emma. You never were. Your mother had you before she met William. Your biological father was a man she knew briefly before she came into our lives, a man who was never part of your life and never wanted to be. William adopted you after the wedding. He stood before a judge and promised to love you and protect you and raise you as his own daughter. And he did. For 2 years, he did. 2 years. I had lived in this house for 2 years, as the adopted daughter of William Ashford, as a member of this family. And I had no memory of it beyond the fragments that had been haunting me since the moment Liam's car turned onto the tree-lined driveway. "What happened?" I asked, my voice breaking on the words. "Why did we leave? Why don't I remember any of this? Why did my mother never tell me?" Eleanor's expression softened, the sharp edges of her composure giving way to something gentler, something that looked almost like grief. "William died," she said simply. "He was killed in a boating accident when you were 6 years old. It was a beautiful summer day, and he had taken his sailboat out on the lake, something he had done 100 times before. A sudden storm came up out of nowhere, the kind of storm that the old-timers in this area still talk about. His boat capsized, and he was drowned before anyone could reach him. He was 42 years old, in the prime of his life, with a wife who adored him and a little girl who called him daddy. And just like that, he was gone." I closed my eyes, and a tear slipped down my cheek, followed by another and another. I was crying for a man I didn't remember, a man who had adopted me and loved me and died before I was old enough to hold on to the memory of him. "And my mother?" I whispered. "What happened to my mother after he died?" "She was devastated," Eleanor said, and her own voice was thick with emotion now, the carefully maintained composure cracking at the edges. "She loved William with her whole heart. When he died, a part of her died with him. She walked around this house like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping, barely speaking. We tried to help her. We tried to comfort her. We begged her to stay, to let us take care of her and take care of you. But she couldn't bear it. Every room in this house, every corner of the garden, every view from every window reminded her of William and the life they had built together and the future they would never have. About 6 months after the funeral, she made the decision to leave. She packed up your things and her things, and she took you away, and we never heard from her again. We wrote letters. We made phone calls. We sent messages through lawyers and friends, and anyone we could think of. She never responded. She simply disappeared, and she took you with her." The room was very quiet. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows and casting long golden rectangles of light across the floor, but I barely noticed. I was lost in the past, in the story that Eleanor was telling me, in the sudden, devastating understanding of everything my mother had kept from me. She had taken me away from this family, the family that had been mine for 2 years, and she had never told me about them. She had let me grow up believing I was alone in the world, without relatives, without history, without roots. And all the while, there was an entire family just 2 hours away, a family that had loved me and lost me and never known what became of me. Why didn't she tell me? I whispered, more to myself than to Eleanor. Why did she keep this from me? I had a right to know. I had a right to know about William, about this family, about the life I had before she took me away. Why would she hide all of this from me? Eleanor reached across the space between us and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. I don't know the full answer to that question, she said gently. Only your mother could tell you, and she is no longer here. But I can tell you what I believe. I believe your mother was so shattered by William's death that she couldn't bear anything that reminded her of him. And you, Emma, you were the most powerful reminder of all. You were the child he had adopted, the child he had loved as his own. Every time she looked at you, she saw him. Every time you laughed, she heard his laugh. Every time you called her mommy, she remembered that you used to call him daddy. I think she ran away from us because she was running away from her grief, and she thought that if she could just get far enough away, if she could just start over somewhere new, the pain would eventually fade. I think she didn't tell you because she was trying to protect you from the same grief that was consuming her. And I think she didn't tell you because she was ashamed of what she had done, of taking you away from a family that loved you, of cutting you off from a history that was rightfully yours. I sat in silence, absorbing her words, trying to reconcile the mother I had known, the mother who had been kind and loving and fiercely protective of me, with the woman Eleanor was describing. My mother had worked 2 jobs to support us. She had sacrificed everything to give me a good life. She had been my entire world, my only family, my constant source of love and support. But she had also lied to me. She had hidden an entire chapter of my existence from me, a chapter that included a stepfather who had adopted me, a family who had welcomed me, a house where I had been happy. She had changed my name from Emily to Emma, and I had never questioned it, never suspected that the name change was part of a larger erasure of my own history. She had told me stories about Ashford House as if it were a fairy tale, and I had believed her, never dreaming that the fairy tale was true and that I had lived it. Does anyone else know? I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. Does Liam know? His parents? His sisters? Eleanor shook her head slowly. Liam was only a baby when you lived here, barely a year old. He wouldn't remember you. His parents, Edward and Margaret, might remember that William had a stepdaughter named Emily, but I doubt they would recognize you as that same child. You were a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, and now you're a grown woman. And your name was different. Your mother called you Emily back then, a name William chose for you after the adoption was finalized. It was a name that belonged to this family, the name of William's own grandmother. When your mother left and changed your name to Emma, she cut the last thread that connected you to us. It never occurred to any of us that the woman Liam brought home might be the same little girl we lost 20 years ago. I sat in that chair for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, trying to process the enormity of what I had learned. My entire life, my entire sense of who I was, had been built on a foundation of incomplete information. I had believed I was alone in the world except for my mother. I had believed I had no family, no history, no roots. And now I was discovering that I had been part of a family, a real family, a family that had loved me and lost me and spent 20 years wondering what had become of me. I was discovering that my mother, the person I had trusted most in the world, had kept a secret from me that had shaped the entire course of my life. I need to tell Liam, I said finally, my voice firmer now, the shock beginning to give way to a sense of purpose. He has a right to know. We're supposed to be getting married in 4 months. He needs to know that I was once part of his family, that we're connected in ways neither of us realized. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yes, she said. He does need to know. And I think, when you tell him, you'll find that it doesn't change anything between you. You're not related by blood. You were raised in different families. The connection you share now is the one you built as adults, Two people who met and fell in love without knowing anything about the history that links them. That connection is real and valid and beautiful. The past doesn't have to undo the present. It just adds another layer to the story. I found Liam in the garden, standing by the old stone fountain with the statue of the dancing girl at its center. He was throwing pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread outward in concentric circles, his shoulders tense with worry. He turned when he heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and the look on his face, the mixture of confusion and concern and fear, told me that he had been imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios, that he had been preparing himself for bad news. My grandmother told me, he said, his voice quiet but steady. While you were in her sitting room, I went to find her nurse, and she told me that my grandmother had already sent word that she was expecting you. So I waited. And then my grandmother came to find me, about half an hour ago, and she told me everything. About your mother and my Uncle William. About you living here when you were little. About the adoption and the accident and your mother taking you away. About all of it. I stopped a few feet away from him, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my hands trembling at my sides. Are you okay? I asked, and the question felt ridiculously inadequate. A tiny band-aid on a wound that was vast and deep and still bleeding. I don't know, he admitted honestly. I'm trying to process it. The woman I love, the woman I asked to marry me, turns out to have been part of my family 20 years ago. My uncle adopted you. You lived in this house. You played in this garden. You called my grandmother Nana, just like I did. That's not something you expect to hear. It's not something you can easily wrap your mind around. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration and confusion. But I've been standing here thinking about it for the past half hour, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. You're the same person you were yesterday. You're the same Emma I fell in love with. The fact that you played in this garden when you were 4 years old, that my uncle adopted you, that my family loved you before I ever knew you, none of that changes who you are now. None of that changes how I feel about you. But we're cousins, I said, the word feeling strange and wrong in my mouth, like a piece of clothing that didn't fit. By marriage, at least. Doesn't that bother you? Doesn't that feel strange? It's not a blood relation, he said firmly, stepping toward me and closing the distance between us. My Uncle William was my father's brother. He adopted you, but he wasn't your biological father. You and I share no DNA. We share a history, a complicated and unexpected and beautiful history, but we don't share genetics. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more I feel like there's something almost magical about it. You were meant to be part of this family. You were part of it once, as a little girl, and then you were lost, and now you've found your way back. Through me, through us, through the love we built without knowing anything about the past that connects us. That doesn't feel like a tragedy to me, Emma. It feels like fate. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation, any indication that he was just saying what he thought he should say. But I didn't find any. I found only the same steady, unwavering love that had been there since the day we met. And finally, the tears I had been holding back broke free, and I was crying, sobbing, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. Liam pulled me into his arms and held me tightly, his hand stroking my hair, his voice murmuring words of comfort that I couldn't quite hear but could feel in the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. I don't remember him, I said, my voice muffled against his chest. William, my stepfather. I don't remember being adopted. I don't remember being loved by him. I only have fragments, little flashes of memory that don't connect to anything. The way the light looks through the library windows, the taste of cookies in the kitchen, the sound of someone laughing as they chased me through the garden. But I don't remember his face. I don't remember his voice. I wish I could remember more. You will, Liam said, his arms tightening around me. Now that you're back, now that you know the truth, the memories will come. And my family, our family, will help you fill in the gaps. My grandmother has photo albums going back decades. She has old letters, home movies on VHS tapes that my father has been meaning to digitize for years. She has the adoption papers, the legal documents, the records of the 2 years you spent with us. There's a whole history here waiting for you to rediscover it. And I'll be with you every step of the way. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of revelations and reunions that felt almost dreamlike in their intensity. Eleanor gathered the entire family in the formal living room, the same room where they had welcomed me as a stranger just the day before, and she told them who I really was. She stood before them, this tiny woman with her cane and her blanket and her 87 years of life, and she spoke with the authority of a matriarch who had held this family together through wars and depressions and tragedies of every kind. She told them about William and Claire, about the adoption, about the little girl named Emily who had lived in this house for 2 years and then disappeared without a trace. She told them that I was that little girl, grown up and returned to them through a twist of fate that none of them could have predicted. Edward and Margaret stared at me with expressions of dawning recognition, their eyes searching my adult face for traces of the child they had known. "I remember you," Margaret said slowly, her voice filled with wonder. "You were so quiet, so serious for such a little girl. You used to follow William around like a shadow, holding onto the hem of his jacket. He called you his little duckling." She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We mourned you, Emily. When your mother took you away and wouldn't answer our letters, we mourned you almost as much as we mourned William. It was like losing 2 members of the family at once." Caroline and Amelia, who had been young children themselves when I lived here, admitted that they had faint, fragmentary memories of a cousin named Emily who had played with them in the garden. "I remember the maze," Caroline said, her brow furrowed with concentration. "We used to play hide-and-seek in the hedges. You were always better at hiding than I was. I could never find you." "I remember the cookies," Amelia added. "Nana used to bake these big sugar cookies with pink frosting, and you would eat the frosting off first and leave the cookie part for last. I thought that was the strangest thing I had ever seen." And one by one, they all came to the same conclusion that Liam had reached, the same conclusion that Eleanor had been quietly hoping for since the moment she realized who I was. I was family. I had always been family. The years of separation, the changed name, the forgotten memories, none of that altered the fundamental truth that I belonged here. I had belonged here 20 years ago, and I belonged here now. The photo albums came out, heavy leather-bound volumes filled with pictures of a life I had forgotten, but that was slowly, piece by piece, coming back to me. I saw myself at 4 years old, sitting on William's shoulders in front of the fountain, my face split in a gap-toothed grin that I recognized from my own childhood photographs. I saw my mother, younger and happier than I had ever known her, her hair longer and her face less lined, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. I saw the white room at the end of the hall, decorated with pink curtains and a mobile of paper butterflies that I now remembered watching as I fell asleep, their delicate shapes spinning slowly in the breeze from the open window. The memories came flooding back, triggered by the photographs, by the stories, by the familiar voices of the people around me who had known me when I was small. They told me about William, my stepfather, the man who had adopted me without hesitation because he said that any child of Claire's was a child of his. They told me about how he had taught me to swim in the lake behind the house, holding me up in the water with his strong hands, and telling me I was brave and strong and capable of anything. They told me about the way he used to read to me at bedtime, doing all the different voices for the characters, making me laugh so hard I couldn't fall asleep. They told me about the locket he had commissioned for my 6th birthday, a silver locket with pictures of him and my mother inside, a gift he never got to give because he died 2 weeks before the party. Eleanor brought out the locket, still in its original velvet box, still waiting for the little girl who had never come back to claim it. She placed it in my hands, her own hands trembling, and she said, "He would want you to have this. He loved you so much, Emma. You were his daughter in every way that mattered. He would be so happy to know that you found your way back to us." I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling its weight settle against my heart, and I realized that the emptiness I had carried my entire life, the sense of being alone in the world, of having no roots and no history, was finally beginning to fill. I had a family. I had always had a family. I just hadn't known it. In the months that followed, I learned everything I could about my forgotten past. I spent hours with Eleanor, listening to her stories about William, about my mother, about the 2 years I had spent in this house. I visited William's grave, a quiet spot in the family cemetery overlooking a grove of ancient oak trees, and I knelt in the grass and thanked him for the love he had given me when I was too young to remember it. I told him I was sorry I had forgotten him, sorry I had never known to miss him, sorry that my mother's grief had stolen the years we should have had together. And I promised him that I would carry his memory with me for the rest of my life. I went through boxes of my mother's letters, correspondence she had written to Eleanor before William's death, and I saw a side of her I had never known. A woman who had been deeply in love and deeply happy. A woman who had written pages and pages about the joy of watching William teach me to ride a tricycle, about the way he always brought her flowers on Fridays, about the future they were planning together. A woman whose grief, when it came, was so overwhelming that it destroyed her ability to stay connected to the people who had loved her and loved William and loved me. I also began to understand my mother's choice in a way I hadn't been able to at first. She hadn't kept me from this family out of malice or cruelty. She had done it out of pain, a pain so immense and so consuming that she couldn't see past it. She had been so shattered by William's death that she couldn't bear to stay in the house where they had built a life together, couldn't bear to see his family and be reminded of everything she had lost. She had thought she was protecting me, shielding me from the grief that was destroying her. She had been wrong, profoundly wrong, but she had loved me, and she had done what she thought was best. I forgave her. It took time, and it took work, and it took many long conversations with Eleanor and with Liam and with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. But eventually, I forgave her. And in forgiving her, I freed myself from the anger that had been building since the moment I learned the truth. Liam and I postponed the wedding. Not because we were having doubts, not because the revelation about our shared history had changed how we felt about each other, but because we wanted to take the time to fully integrate me back into the family before we added the complexity of a wedding. We wanted to give everyone, ourselves included, a chance to adjust to the new reality. We wanted to make sure that when I walked down the aisle, I was walking toward a future that was built on a solid foundation of truth and understanding. And on the day that we finally did marry, a perfect September afternoon with the leaves just beginning to turn and the air crisp and cool, I stood in the little white room at the end of the hall, the room that had been mine when I was 4 years old. It had been unlocked and lovingly restored, the pink curtains replaced with soft cream, the paper butterflies taken down and preserved in a shadow box that now hung on the wall. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my veil, the silver locket warm against my skin, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The mother who had loved me and lost me and hidden the truth from me. The stepfather who had adopted me and given me his name, even if only for 2 years. The family who had never stopped hoping I would come back. And Liam, my Liam, the man who had brought me home without even knowing it. Eleanor knocked on the door and came in, her tiny frame leaning heavily on her cane, her sharp eyes glistening with tears she was too proud to let fall. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "William would be so proud. He loved you like you were his own daughter, and he would be so happy to see you today, marrying his nephew, becoming an Ashford in name as well as in heart." I turned from the mirror and crossed the room to take her hands in mine. "Thank you," I said, my own voice breaking, "for telling me the truth, for welcoming me back, for being my grandmother when I didn't know I had one, for everything." Eleanor squeezed my hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "You've always been my granddaughter," she said simply. "I just had to wait 20 years to get you back. Now go. Your husband is waiting." The ceremony was held in the garden, beside the old stone fountain where I had played as a child and where Liam had stood throwing pebbles on the morning when everything changed. The roses were in full bloom, their petals drifting gently to the ground in the soft breeze. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the gathered guests, all of them family, all of them witnesses to the restoration of something that had been broken and lost and was now being made whole again. I walked down the aisle on Edward's arm, and I saw tears in the eyes of everyone I passed. This was not just a wedding. This was a homecoming. This was the closing of a circle that had been broken for 2 decades. When I reached the end of the aisle and took Liam's hands in mine, he leaned in and whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Welcome home, Emma." I smiled, tears of joy streaming down my face, and I whispered back, "I've been home since the day I met you. I just didn't know it yet." The pastor spoke the words, the rings were exchanged, and when Liam kissed me, I heard the sound of applause and happy tears in Eleanor's voice, clear and strong despite her years, saying, "Finally, finally, she's come home."